Okay, folks, this is the video for Chapter 3, which is Evolution and Population Ecology. It starts out with a case study about Hawaii and the birds in Hawaii. And Hawaii is an interesting case because they have a lot of endemic species, which endemic means it's found only in one place. So these are found only in Hawaii, and a lot of endangered species. And so they are under threat from invasive species, like things that people have brought in, like pigs and goats and foreign plants and mongoose, which are things that hunt snakes. And then also disease that has come in through various places. So it's, Hawaii is kind of interesting because it's an island, and so it's got this, kind of contained population, and then they're only found there. And so that's what this case study is about. It's interesting and you should read it. Then we turn the page, continues, that's still a part about Hawaii. Then the first section, 3.1, is evolution, the source of Earth's biodiversity. You don't have to know a ton about macroevolution for this class, but you are going to need to know some of the things that cause species to evolve, like things about selection pressures and things like that. So you should know on this page, you should know species and population. Species is a particular type of organism that can mate and produce viable offspring. Sometimes there are species that could mate, but they just don't. And then so those would be considered different species if they don't mate with each other for whatever reason. And so they're considered different. Population then is a group of individuals of a given species that live in the same area. On the next page, on 51, you should know natural selection. So that's kind of what you learned last year in biology about evolution. Natural selection is often survival of the fittest, although it is more appropriate to say survival of the fit. All that means is that an organism is well adapted to its environment and that it lives a long time and successfully reproduces. They do that through a variety of ways. There's adaptations, and then there are mutations. So adaptation is just a variety in an organism based sometimes on a mutation and sometimes just on like conditions about how it was born or grew up. And so it might make it better or worse suited for that environment. And so therefore it might be selected for, which means that it has a good trait and survives, or selected against, which means it has a bad trait and dies. Sometimes in apes, they call that being maladapted, or it's a maladaptive trait. So those are like the main things about evolution and selection that you should really understand. An organism does not evolve. Species evolve. Mutations within organisms can cause the species to evolve if that mutation is an advantageous adaptation. If it is a good trait and they survive, then they are selected for. They live longer and they reproduce more, and that trait will spread through the population. Then we turn to 52. No figure and caption here. So these are some birds that live in Hawaii. They're called honey creepers. And if you look at the original population here, they had, this is showing the beak length and this is showing the individuals. And then it was kind of normally distributed. It's called a normal distribution, but you don't really need to know that. And then there is a selection here for shorter beaks, which means that the population will shift this way. And then there was some other location that had a selection pressure for longer beaks, and the population shifted that way. And so these are just, it's just an interesting, it shows you how a population can diverge over time. Then you should know artificial selection. We did the POGIL about that, and you're going to have an Edpuzzle. This is, people selectively breeding for certain traits. Artificial selection is always from people. If a person does something that causes selection pressures, that's not artificial selection. That's just people messing with the habitat or, the ecological niche of an organism. So the example of artificial selection is crops and livestock and dog breeds. I was talking about this in one class. The brassicas, all of these came from the same original plant. And if you saw some of the original plants of our crop plants, you wouldn't believe that they were the same thing. Then we move on to 54. And there's this picture here. This is the start of where they talk about biological diversity, which is usually just pronounced biodiversity. And it talks about how that can be a lot of different things. It can be genetic diversity within a population. It can be the diversity of species in an ecosystem. So there's just different meanings of the word biodiversity. If we are talking about it in terms of genetic diversity in a population, if some populations drift too far apart, then we say that they become different species. And that's what this is talking about, a type of speciation. It's called allopatric speciation, and this happens from geographical separation. So like here they show that there was a single population, and then there was a isolation event, I think in this one that looks like lava flow, and so these two populations were separated, and then over time something happened over here to where the yellow one was selected for, and this one basically stayed the same. And so now when this cools and they can actually come back together, they may not realize that they are the same population, that if they don't breed, then they are not considered the same species anymore. So ways that that can happen, some types of geographical isolation, there can be lava flows, there can be glaciers, rivers can change their course, which they almost never do anymore because of human interference, but they used to a long time ago. And then mountains rise up through plate tectonics. I mean, that happens obviously over millions of years, but it can change, it can separate species. And then there can be sea level rise and drought. So these are types of things that could cause geographical isolation that will lead to possible speciation. This picture right here is a phylogenetic tree. You really don't need to know that for apes. It's not emphasized in our curriculum. And so then there's this one here, and it's kind of the same thing. Then we move on to page 58, and this is talking about organism classification, which again is not really something that you have to know in apes, but just it's this idea that there is, you know, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and that's the way that we organize all living organisms on the planet. Okay, then moving over here to page 59. The important part on here is this, again, idea of endemic species. Endemic species are found only in one place on Earth. One of the common things for this is islands. And because of that, they are very susceptible to becoming endangered or extinct. If you think about Australia, Australia is an island continent, and it has been separated from Pangaea for a long time, and they have a lot of species there that are only found in Australia. So those are all endemic species. Page 60 starts to talk about, along with speciation, there's this idea of extinctions. And extinctions have been going on since organisms have been on the planet. 99% of all of the organisms that have ever, types of organisms that have ever been on the planet have gone extinct. It's natural, and this is called a background extinction rate. There's competition, there's evolution, there's all kinds of things that happen, but things are always going extinct. And that's normal. But there have been mass extinctions throughout history, and we know of 5 of them previously. Mass extinctions are defined by 50 to 95% of the species on the planet being wiped out. The big one was the KT event, and that was the Cretaceous Tertiary one. That was the one that took out the dinosaurs. And there were 4 other ones. There's been 5 previous ones. That's the famous one that everybody knows. We are currently in the middle of a 6th mass extinction event, and this one is man-made. People are doing activities and causing harm in ways that are causing mass extinctions. Then the next section, ecology and the organism, we start looking at the levels of ecological organization. So I said, like, to know this picture starts with the biosphere is the biggest. Generally, actually, we start at the bottom. Organism is any living thing, plant, animal, fungus, bacteria, whatever. It's an organism. Then you have population, which is a group of individuals of that species living in a particular area. Then you move up to community, which is a bunch of populations living together. So these are, here's a turtle, here's a bunch of turtles, here's turtles living with coral and other fishes and things like that. Then we have the ecosystem, and this is all of the living and non-living parts that are interacting. And then landscape, but you could also think of that as a biome. And then the biosphere, which is the sum total of all the living things on the earth. You should also on this page know the term ecology. I feel like everybody probably has a pretty good grasp of what that is. And ecosystems and habitat. So habitat is, where something lives. So habitat is where something lives. Niche, whatever, is like the job that the thing does. So that's on another page. Then we get into some ways that animals live. You should know generalist versus specialist. A generalist can eat lots of different types of food. They can live in lots of different places. They're just kind of like, you would say, not picky, like a raccoon, right? Then you think about a specialist. A specialist has a very narrow niche that it can live in, a very narrow habitat maybe, or a very narrow type of food. And so they are more likely to become endangered or extinct. If you think about koala bears that only eat eucalyptus leaves, if something were, if a disease were to wipe out the eucalyptus trees, then the koalas would likely go extinct. You should also know this picture and caption. This is about the passenger pigeon, which is really like the most famous animal extinction that has happened because of human activity. Let's see what else. And then over here on page 63, it talks about, so we've moved on now to population ecology, and this is like population size and things like that, where they live, their distribution. Population distribution can be described in one of three ways. It can be random, where everything is just kind of all mixed up and there's no pattern. It can be uniform, and in this case they show you like the penguins at their nesting site, and they are evenly spaced. Everybody has their own sort of little personal space that they clear out, so the penguins are all uniformly spaced here. Or it can be clumped, where you have like a bunch and then empty space and a bunch and empty space and so on. So those are three ways that population can be distributed, but you should know like most of the terms on that page. Then we have another thing about restoring the forest in Hawaii, which, they do try to do some success stories in here, so it doesn't seem all bad. Then on to page 66, talks about how populations grow and shrink. There's a whole bunch of math stuff here for animal populations. We will do this math later when we study human population growth, so you should read it, but this is not really going to be included in this unit. But you should understand some of the gist of how things grow. So there's this idea of exponential growth, which is unlimited or unhindered. So if there's unlimited resources and there is no predation and nothing is stopping it from growing, it will follow this type of curve. So like one dove might have 6 babies, and then its 6 babies might have 6 babies, and now you suddenly have 36 and so on. And so you get this type of curve, and it's called, in apes, it's called a J curve, but that shows exponential growth. But in reality, that can't happen forever because things will get preyed on or they will run out of resources and so on. And so when they reach that point, that's called their carrying capacity. So in this, it shows their carrying capacity. So you have the exponential growth portion, and then you have limiting factors like resource availability and disease and predation. And so they're showing it as a weight because it's like tamping down the population. This type of curve is logistic growth. And so that growth is limited by factors at the carrying capacity, and it's called an S curve. And that's really because this one looks like a J and this one looks like an S. So this dotted line in here, it's kind of hard to see, is the carrying capacity. And then this would be a stable population. So basically as many are dying as are being born, and so they're kind of at their carrying capacity. Carrying capacity can shift. If more resources become available, then the amount that can live there could go up. If habitat destruction happens, then fewer can live in that location, and so on. Then you should know this figure and caption here about exponential growth slowing over time. So many things, if they discover a new resource, they will start to grow exponentially. And then as that resource availability becomes limited, then that exponential growth will taper off. Moving on to page 68. There's a lot on this page. So along with these limits to growth, that you should know that some of them are density dependent and some of them are density independent. If it is density dependent, then that has to do with how closely the organisms live together. So if you think about the way like colds and flus spread through a school, that's density dependent. Everybody is close together and it passes through. Density independent doesn't matter how close together the organisms live. So this could be like a tornado or a hurricane or something. It will go through and affect a population, and it doesn't matter how densely packed they are. And then we move on to basically here, it's kind of hard to see. Let me do this. How life history strategies can vary among species. This graph right here is very important. It shows you survivorship curves. There are 3 main ways that organisms survive. They live their life out. Type 1 is this one right here. Type 1, it says most live young. So what that means is most of the young live past infancy, and then the organism dies when it gets old. So the example of this is like humans and the great apes, whales, other top predators, large mammals, things like that. Most of them, so this is age and this is number of survivors. So there's a lot of survivors in infancy, and then as you get older, the population tapers down. A type 2 survivorship curve, which is this middle one, you're equally likely to die whether you're young or old, right? Birds get preyed on a lot, so birds are a classic example of this. A lot of them die when they're young, and there's like a continuous death rate throughout their lifetime. So it doesn't matter how old or young they are, they're equally likely to die. And then you have the type 3 organisms, which have a high death rate when young, but it's low when they're old. So if they survive to adulthood, they tend to live for a long time. These tend to be prey animals, or if you think about plants, plants put out a ton of seeds. Not every seed lands on fertile ground and grows. So, but if they do, then they are likely to become a plant and grow for a long time. And then sea turtles. I'm sure everybody has seen videos about the sea turtles racing to the ocean, and a whole bunch of them get picked off when they're little. But if they make it to the ocean and then grow to adulthood, they're likely to live for a long time. So those are the survivorship curves. You definitely need to know those. And then you should also know in this section over here about biotic potential, which is the number of offspring that a female can have. Not how many they do have, but how many they could have. Human females could probably have, honestly, like 20 babies in their lifetime, but they don't. We control that, but we could. And so some animals don't really control their population like that. So there's a couple ways that their biotic potential is defined. Sometimes they are said to be K-selected, and they're K-selected because their populations tend to stabilize near their carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity is a capital K. That's the abbreviation for it. So K-selected are stable near their carrying capacity. And these would be animals that have just a small number of offspring. They provide a lot of parental care, and then the offspring, stay with the parent for a long time. So like humans are K-selected, but so are things like a kangaroo or an ape or an elephant. A lot of large mammals are K-selected, and that's because they keep their young with them and they take care of them. Our selected species tend to be prey species. They have a high biotic potential. So these are animals that have lots of babies, lots of time. So you think about a rabbit, they'll have, maybe 5 litters a year with, 4 to 6 baby rabbits in it. And so they're having just tons of babies all year long. And that's just in order for the population to survive because they're getting preyed on so much. And the R is basically for the fact that if there were no limits, they would grow exponentially. They are rate selected. Then it talks about conserving biodiversity, which is really kind of the end. But conserving biodiversity is important for so many reasons, and you should read that. But one of the ways that they've been able to do that is through something called ecotourism. So rather than a habitat being destroyed for development, they'll make preserves or nature parks, parks like national parks, and then people will come in and tour it for the environment, the ecology that they can see there. And so there are a lot of good examples of ecotourism on here. Costa Rica is one of the most famous examples that has done this. But we want to conserve biodiversity because so many medicines and other things like that have been found through, plants and things like that. And we just, if we lose something, we'll never really know what we lost. And so that's kind of the end of chapter 3.